Hi, I'm Mark from Founders and Tips, and today we are talking with Nir Eyal, a speaker, consultant, and author of the book Hooker: How to Build Habits-Forming Products. Hi, Nir.
Hi, thanks for having me, Mark.
Thanks. Could you please explain your personal profile and why you decide or how you finally decide to write a book, Hooker: How to Build Habit-Forming Products?
Sure. So Hooked came out of my experience in the gaming and advertising space. I was running a company at the intersection of these two industries, which are very dependent on manipulating user behavior. And in that time at that company, I saw a lot of patterns. I saw a lot of experiments, a lot of companies come and go. And the whole time I was curious as to why some companies worked and some companies didn't when it came to their ability to create user habits and to retain user engagement. And to my dismay, I didn't find any cookbook. I didn't find any resources that were made for an entrepreneur looking to figure out how to create habit-forming products. How do you create a product that people come back to time and time again on their own? And so that's the book I wrote. It was the book that I was looking for when I was an entrepreneur. So after that company was acquired, I spent about the next 2.5 years digging through academic research, reading everything I could get my hands on when it came to figuring out user psychology. And the result was this blog that I write at nirandfar.com, and finally the publication of this book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products, which is currently available in Espanol, and yeah, just became available in Espanol on Amazon, and it will be re-released. It's actually off the market today in English. You can't buy it right now because it's being republished by Portfolio, a division of Random House, in November.
Okay, I only read the English version. And how it's the what have any special that the business of gaming and also gambling that have this focus on building habits? What they have that make for them more special than other business, or why they are more advanced than other sectors?
Well, these are two industries. Advertising and gaming are two industries that are really focused on changing user behavior. And in fact, their bottom line depends on it, right? So when you're playing a social game like Candy Crush or the Kardashian game or whatever the latest game might be, those games are designed to influence your behavior in a specific way. And they're very dependent on users coming back on their own. Those businesses would go out of business if they were required to send you an ad every time to bring you back. And of course, advertising, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States alone. That industry is totally dependent on changing user behavior and getting us to do things that advertisers want us to do. So that was kind of my pedigree. That's where I started out from. But then as I started exploring the tech boom here that we're having in Silicon Valley, and I was trying to decide what to do next in my next venture, I came across this conclusion that the companies that are going to make it as the interface shrinks and now we're all on these devices as opposed to desktops and laptops, that habits matter more than ever. That the products that are able to get users to keep coming back that makes the difference between success or failure. And the reason is, very simply, that the real estate isn't there. That when you have, when we all were working from desktops, there was lots of real estate. There was lots of room on someone's screen to trigger them to action. Well, as that shrunk to the laptop and now these mobile devices and soon wearables, that real estate is just much more scarce. And so what we come to depend upon, we can no longer depend upon messages and external triggers and things to bring users back. We have to create these habits if we want people to come back on their own.
What's the difference between persuasion and habit forming, building habit forming?
Sure. So persuasion is any technique that gets users to do what you'd like them to do, with the caveat that it has to be in their interests. Let's differentiate. There's a difference between persuasion and coercion. Persuasion is when you help people do things they want to do, at least in my definition. Whereas coercion is getting people to do things they don't want to do, and that's clearly unethical. That's off limits. And then habit formation uses many of the principles of persuasion to get people to do things in a repeated way. So to get people to have an unprompted engagement to do a particular action.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, you explain a model to build habits. Could you explain briefly the model?
Sure, absolutely. So the model that I explain in the book, Hooked, is called the Hook model. And it essentially has these 4 basic steps. It starts out with a trigger, an action, a reward, typically that's a variable reward, and then finally an investment. And so these 4 basic steps, this pattern, trigger, action, reward, investment, we see repeated time and time again in all sorts of habit-forming products, offline and online.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us a couple of examples to understand a little bit better the model?
Yeah, so the trigger is defined as something that cues the user to action. So anything that prompts you to act a certain way, to take that specific action, that would be an example of a trigger. Now these triggers come in 2 types, 2 flavors, if you will. We have our external triggers, which are things in our environment that tell us what to do next. And then we have internal triggers, and these are associations that prompt us to action where the information for what to do next is in our heads. So an external trigger would be, an email or a notification or a friend telling you something through word of mouth about what you might do next. But an internal trigger is a little different. An internal trigger doesn't require any kind of external prompting. So an emotion, a routine, a situation, a certain place, these things we don't have any explicit information about what to do, and yet when we attach an association with those internal triggers, we act just as reliably. So for example, when we're feeling bored, lonely, disconnected, lost, when we feel these emotions, we look to solutions. We look to something to relieve that negative valence state and take us out of that emotion. And many times that solution is found right here with the technologies we use. So those are examples of the external and internal triggers. The action is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. That's the action phase. Scrolling on Pinterest, pushing the play button on YouTube, going through your news feed or your email. That simple open and scroll technique is very, very popular today. And that would be an example of an action, the simplest thing you can do to get your reward. The reward phase is next. That's the 3rd step of the hook. And the reward phase is where the user's itch is scratched, where the user is given what they came for. So if the user came because they're bored, that's when they're entertained. If the user came because they're lonely, they're seeking connection, that's where they're connected to another human being. And it turns out that many habit-forming products, in fact, most habit-forming products, have some kind of element of mystery, some degree of variability involved with what the user might get when they open the app, some kind of variable reward. And then finally comes the investment phase. The investment phase is the last step of the hook, and it's where the user puts something of value, some kind of work into the product, which makes the experience better for the user and makes it more likely for them to return in the future. So it can be accruing followers, content, right? The more content I create or I organize. It can be data, the more data I give the company. It can be reputation. The more reputation I have on a platform, the more likely I am to come back. And then it could be skill acquisition. The more time I spend on acquiring a skill in a game or in an app, or even I was writing an article about Microsoft Office, the part of the investment and why Microsoft Office has been a habit-forming product for so many people is because they spend all this time investing in how to use the product, right? Photoshop is not the best tool in the world, but people have invested so much time learning how it works that they're not going to go anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So those 4 basic steps, trigger, action, reward, and investment, those are the 4 fundamental steps of a habit-forming technology.
Okay. Going step by step on triggers, beginning by triggers, What's the best practice to create good triggers?
So the trigger, so when it comes to external and internal triggers, the secrets to success, the formula for how to create good external triggers are that the external trigger has to be closely coupled with the internal trigger. Now, there's all kinds of people who specialize in where to place external triggers, where you should place your call to action and how your email should look. And there's all kinds of an art and science around placing external triggers. But something I think people don't consider, and I think is a missed opportunity, is that when the external trigger is very distant from the internal trigger, meaning if I get a message, but I don't feel the pain, I don't feel the need to act on that external trigger, that's spam, right? That doesn't have a direct connection to me. But if you can place the external trigger, the moment I feel that emotion, that routine, that situation that I'm creating association with that internal trigger, that's magical, right? That's the ultimate secret to finding how to place good external triggers, is when you can send someone a message on what to do next the moment they're feeling that internal trigger.
Okay. And about actions, what are the main errors you see on the action steps?
Sure. So the action phase is defined as the simplest behavior in anticipation of a reward. And for that section of the hook, I actually draw upon the work of B.J. Fogg, who is a researcher here at Stanford. And he gives a very simple and yet comprehensive framework that explains all human behavior, believe it or not. And he gives this very simple formula. It's B equals MAT. B stands for behavior, M is motivation, A is ability, and T is a trigger. So triggers we just talked about. Motivation is the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. And ability is very important when it comes to technology products, because ability is how easy or difficult a behavior is to do. So when we combine those three basic elements, motivation, ability, and a trigger, when we have those insufficient amounts, we get a behavior. We get that action every single time. And so for you as a product designer, if you're developing a product, if you're developing a technology that gets people to act, and you're wondering, how do I make this behavior occur? All you have to do is look at these three basic elements. Does the user have sufficient motivation? And of course, there's a lot more to be said about that, and you can read about a lot more about all of this in the book. But I'm giving you kind of the very short version. Does the user have sufficient ability? Meaning, is the behavior simple enough to do, and can it be made easier? And then finally, is the trigger present? So if you're scratching your head and saying, oh man, we designed this beautiful app, but nobody's doing the intended behavior, you can always ask yourself, does the user have sufficient motivation? Does the user have sufficient ability? And if so, if the trigger is present, the behavior will occur. So you can see where your product is deficient and why that action may not be occurring.
Okay. About variable rewards, I sometimes get doubts about how to balance variable rewards versus fixed rewards, and how to find this balance of expectations about well-known rewards that I'm going to get when I'm using an interface.
Sure.
Some tips or advice about that?
Yeah, so the variable reward insights come to us from the classic work of B.F. Skinner. You may remember B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. In Skinner's famous experiments, he took these pigeons, he put them inside a cage, and he gave them a little disc to press on. And at first, when the pigeon clicked on the lever, a food pellet, a reward, would come out on a predictable schedule. Pigeon would click on the lever, get a food pellet. And basically, the pigeon ate whenever they were hungry. But then Skinner did something a little bit different. Skinner introduced variability. He introduced a bit of mystery. So sometimes the pigeon would click on the disc, nothing would come out. The next time the pigeon would click on the disc, they would receive a reward. And it turned out that by introducing that bit of mystery, that bit of variability, the rate of response, the number of times the pigeons clicked, increased. So it turns out that variability, a bit of mystery behind an experience, actually increases engagement. It makes the behavior more likely to occur, interestingly enough. And so in all sorts of habit-forming products, we find these variable rewards. Now, your question related to when do I use a variable reward versus when do I not use a variable reward starts by asking, what's the internal trigger? All right, what's the itch that your product is scratching? So let's take a look at two products, one that doesn't really use a variable reward and one that does. Let's take a look at Pinterest compared to a Google image search. So when you're on Pinterest, Pinterest is a product that's used, the internal trigger is boredom. It's something that people turn to. They used to flip magazines and clip out things from magazines or just browse on the web. And now Pinterest is about this beautiful pinboard that people go to be entertained, to see interesting objects, right? That's what it's all, interesting images. It's a boredom trigger. So variability is very important to a company like Pinterest because the internal trigger, the need for the product comes out of this need to alleviate boredom. Take a look at a similar product that is really all about images as well, the Google image search. Now, if you typed in teddy bear onto a Google image search, you would probably get many images that look pretty similar, right? It's probably going to be a brown toy that looks like a bear, like a child's teddy bear. It's not going to be very variable. It's going to be pretty conformist. Now, why is that? Well, because the itch, the internal trigger around using a Google image search query is very different from why I might use Pinterest. I'm not doing a Google image search because I want to be entertained. I've got a need I need fulfilled. I need to find a picture of a teddy bear now. And so it's about relevancy. Google needs to give me the most likely answer to my query. And so that's why the most likely answer when you browse is kind of the same thing in those slightly different variations. So it's really about the internal trigger. If your product is about relieving uncertainty, giving the answer as quickly as possible is the right reward. But if the internal trigger is about alleviating boredom, you may want more variability in your product, kind of like how a Pinterest does it.
About the last step, investment, could you please give us some more examples, especially in what time frame is the good time to introduce the investment concept to the user?
So investment can come in all different forms. It's really defined as something that the user does, some bit of work, some bit of effort that the user does to put value into the product. And it's all about increasing the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. So investments, the characteristics of an investment is that they load the next trigger. So for example, when I send a message on WhatsApp, I don't get any immediate reward. There's no immediate gratification. But what I'm doing is I'm making it more likely I will use the platform in the future because every time I send a message, I'm likely to get a reply. And that reply is loading the next trigger because I'm going to get a notification on my phone that says, hey, somebody replied to you. That's an external trigger, which gets me to go back through the hook once again. So investments load the next trigger and they store value. Storing value is a super important concept, and it's a hallmark of habit-forming products. Because unlike things in the physical world, my phone and these tables and chairs and everything made of atoms, all of these things depreciate. They lose value with use. All the physical elements of them lose value. Software, and particularly habit-forming technology, can do the opposite. Habit-forming technology should get better and better and better with use because of this concept I call stored value, meaning the more times I invest in it, the more I use it, the more I pass through these 4 steps of the hook, the more valuable the product becomes to me. So the more followers I accrue on Twitter, that's a form of investment. I become very unlikely to leave a platform like Twitter if I've already accrued all these followers, right? So if you were to ask someone who has 10 followers or 10,000 followers, who's more likely to quit Twitter? Right, it's going to be the person with 10 followers, right? If Twitter were going to charge you money to use Twitter and say, hey, you have to send us a check to use the product, who's going to stay on board? The person with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers. So that's one form of investment, followers. Content. The more content I put into a site, like on iTunes, the more music I collect inside iTunes, the more valuable it becomes as my one and only music library. The more data I give a site, like on mint.com or on Pinterest, the more data I give the site, the better it becomes just for me. So if you were to log into my Pinterest account, it actually wouldn't be that interesting to you because it's been tailored to my interests based on my investments. And then finally, reputation. So on Airbnb or TaskRabbit or eBay, my reputation score is a form of stored value I can literally take to the bank. Why? Because my reputation determines what I can charge for my goods and services. And how likely am I to leave one of these sites like eBay or TaskRabbit or Airbnb once I've accrued all that reputation? I've invested all that effort in creating a good reputation for myself. And so that's pretty sticky. It makes it pretty unlikely that I'm going to leave and switch to some competitor's platform.
All right. And as a consultant, as an expert on habit forming, what kind of problems or complaints did you find more often on the companies you are working for?
So the most frequently neglected part of the hook is the investment phase. And I think it's not across the board. Every company I work with is a little bit different. Sometimes the company has a deficient trigger. They really haven't figured out what their internal triggers are, or they haven't found a good way to place an external trigger. Or the action is too complicated. It's not simple enough. Or the variable reward actually isn't very variable. It's not interesting. It doesn't change. Or they are missing the investment. But I think the most common place that people neglect the hook is the investment phase. Because it's a little bit counterintuitive. Because I'm telling you in the action phase, and kind of the sacred cow of the design community today is make everything simple, right? Everything has to be slicky, right? People have to go through the site quickly as possible, go to checkout and gone. Well, that's not exactly always the case. That there's a point in time after the user gets what they want out of the site, after they've been rewarded, that if you're not asking them to invest in the site, you're missing an opportunity. That if you want users to come back to your site, get them to invest. Get them to do something that loads the next trigger and stores value in the product.
Right. Any final advice to people that wants to apply all this model to the software?
So one thing I didn't mention is that this isn't for everybody, that not every product in the world has to form habits. There are plenty of businesses that don't need habits, that it's a one-time use product. So, there's plenty of businesses that deliver a lot of valuable things to their customers, that can make money for their shareholders and employees and investors that don't need habits, and that's totally fine. But if your business requires unprompted engagement, requires users to come back on their own, just like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and Pinterest, all these companies have to have users coming back on their own or they'll be out of business, right? They can't afford to spend money on advertising every time someone comes back. If you're that kind of company, then you need the hook. You have to figure out, how does your product have these 4 steps in it? The trigger, the action, reward, and investment. And my hope is that by analyzing your business with this framework, you can spend less time building the wrong stuff, right? Less time wasting money and your precious resources of your own personal capital, your own time, and spend more time building something that's really going to work, that's going to be a successful company, and is going to improve the lives of your users.
Okay, Nir, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. There's much more in your book. I recommend everybody to read it, more now than it's in Spanish. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark.